He was just doing a routine patrol in the national park when he noticed strange bubbles on the surface of the lake. At first, it looked like a minor anomaly, but the smell grew stronger, the water turned darker, and animals around the area began to die. When specialists started draining the lake, they discovered something on the bottom that was never supposed to be there. What had been hidden underwater for decades forced authorities to urgently evacuate everyone. Subscribe and write in the comments which city or country you're watching this video from. The morning always arrived gently in this part of the country. It came first as a thin gray light that slipped between the tall pines and settled like dust over the winding roads of the national park. By the time the sun finally pushed above the distant ridgeline, the air already smelled of wet soil, pine resin, and cool stone. The place woke up slowly, as if it did not trust the day enough to greet it all at once. Birds tested their voices one by one. Small streams whispered through the undergrowth. Leaves shifted, touched by an invisible breeze. To anyone passing through, it felt untouched, ancient, perfectly balanced. For Marcus Grant, these mornings were as familiar as his own reflection. He had worked as a park ranger for more than a decade, and by now the rhythm of the park had become the rhythm of his life. He knew the sounds that belonged here and the ones that did not. He recognized the difference between a harmless crack of a falling branch and the sharp, unnatural snap of human interference. He could tell when animals were calm and when they were unsettled. The park spoke constantly, and Marcus had learned to listen. His uniform carried the small signs of long service, faintly faded fabric, boots shaped by countless miles of patrol, a hat softened by years of sun and rain. He was not the kind of ranger who filled his days with unnecessary heroics. He believed in procedure, patience, and attention to detail. Most problems in the park began as tiny irregularities, and Marcus had built his reputation on noticing them before they grew into something larger. Among his colleagues, he was known as steady and careful, a man who did not raise his voice and did not miss much either. The park itself stretched across thousands of acres of protected wilderness, a showcase of forests, cliffs, and clear water. Families came here from all over the country to camp, hike, and breathe air that felt cleaner than anywhere else. There were marked trails, wooden observation decks, and information centers filled with maps and photographs. To visitors, the place looked perfectly organized, almost designed for postcards. To Marcus, it was something more complicated. He knew the hidden corners that tourists never reached, the old service roads that had been abandoned years ago, the sections of land that carried traces of earlier decades when regulations were looser and decisions were made quickly. At the heart of the park lay Crystal Lake, a wide, calm body of water surrounded by thick forest. It was often the first destination recommended to new visitors. On bright days, the lake mirrored the sky so clearly that it was hard to tell where the trees ended and their reflections began. Children swam near the small sandy beach, kayaks moved quietly along the shoreline, and photographers waited patiently for the perfect angle of light. The lake was more than scenery. It was part of the park's water system, connected to small creeks and underground springs that fed life to miles of surrounding land. Marcus had walked its perimeter hundreds of times, checking docks, observing wildlife, and making sure that everything remained as it should be. That morning, his routine began like any other. He arrived before most of the visitors, when the parking lots were still mostly empty, and the campgrounds were only beginning to stir. He drove slowly along the main access road, stopping occasionally to pick up a fallen branch or straighten a crooked sign. The radio on his belt remained quiet. Nothing unusual had been reported overnight. The weather forecast promised a warm, pleasant day. It was exactly the kind of shift Marcus appreciated, calm and predictable. He parked his vehicle near the eastern trailhead and continued on foot, following the familiar path toward the lake. Dew clung to the grass beside the trail, and his boots left dark prints as he walked. A pair of deer watched him from between the trees and then disappeared without alarm. Everything around him suggested another ordinary day in an ordinary week. Marcus liked ordinary days. In his experience, they were the ones that kept the park safe. As he approached the lake, he paused out of habit to listen. Usually, the area was full of small noises: birds calling from the reeds, insects hovering over the surface, the gentle splash of fish breaking water. That morning, the sounds seemed thinner than usual, as if someone had lowered the volume on the entire landscape. Marcus noticed it, but did not immediately attach any meaning to it. Silence could have many explanations. The wooden viewing platform came into sight through the trees, and beyond it stretched the familiar curve of Crystal Lake. From a distance, everything looked normal. The surface reflected the pale sky, and a light mist hovered above the far shore. Marcus stepped onto the platform and rested his hands on the railing, letting his eyes move slowly across the water the way they always did. Checking, observing, confirming that the lake he knew was still the same lake. At first glance, it was. The color seemed right. The shoreline looked unchanged. But as he studied the scene more carefully, a small detail tugged at his attention. Near the center of the lake, not far from an old fallen tree that lay half submerged, the surface of the water looked slightly different. Instead of being perfectly smooth, it carried a faint, uneven texture, almost like the gentle movement of rain. Marcus frowned. There was no wind strong enough to create ripples out there. He leaned forward and narrowed his eyes. Tiny bubbles appeared briefly in that area, rose to the surface, and vanished. It was subtle, easy to miss, and most visitors would never have noticed it at all. Marcus made a mental note. Lakes could produce gas naturally. Decomposing vegetation sometimes released small pockets of air. Nothing about it screamed danger. Still, it was unusual for this particular lake, and unusual things were what his job revolved around. A minute later, another detail reached him, carried on a slow-drifting current of air. A smell, faint but distinct. It was not the clean, earthy scent he associated with the water. This was sharper, heavier, with an unpleasant edge that reminded him of stagnant swamps and something vaguely chemical. He inhaled again to be sure, then glanced around to see if anyone else was nearby who might have noticed it. The platform was empty. The nearest campground lay a good distance away. Marcus did not jump to conclusions. He had learned long ago that nature could produce strange odors without any human help. Rotting algae, decaying fish, changes in temperature, all of it could create temporary discomfort. But the combination of the bubbles and the smell bothered him more than either would have on its own. He took out the small notebook he carried in his pocket and wrote down the time and his observations. It was a simple habit, almost automatic. If something turned out to be important later, he wanted a clear record of when it had begun. He watched the lake for several more minutes, waiting to see if the bubbles would stop or move to another location. They did not. They continued at the same slow, irregular pace, as if something beneath the surface was quietly breathing. For a moment, Marcus considered walking down to the shoreline to investigate more closely, but he decided against it. There was no immediate threat, no sign of pollution on the banks, no dead fish or birds to suggest a serious problem. The responsible approach was to observe, not to disturb. He had a full route to complete that morning, and a single odd patch of water was not enough to abandon it. Before leaving the platform, he took one last long look at Crystal Lake. The mist was beginning to lift now, and sunlight touched the far trees, turning them gold. Apart from that small, restless area near the center, the lake appeared as beautiful as ever. Tourists would be arriving soon with cameras and picnic baskets, expecting the same peaceful scene they had seen on postcards. Marcus turned away and continued along the trail, telling himself that he would check the lake again later in the day. Still, the uneasiness stayed with him as he walked. Over the years, he had learned to trust that feeling. Parks, like people, could hide problems beneath calm surfaces. Most of the time, those problems were minor. Occasionally, they were not. As he disappeared into the trees to finish his rounds, the lake lay quiet behind him, shining in the growing daylight. It looked exactly the way a perfect national park lake was supposed to look. Only a thin column of bubbles rising silently from its center suggested that something, somewhere below, was beginning to change. Marcus finished the rest of his morning route with the same steady discipline he always applied to his work, yet the image of the lake followed him from stop to stop. He checked trail markers and picnic areas, spoke briefly with a family setting up their campsite, and reminded a pair of early hikers to stay on the designated path. Outwardly, he behaved as he did every day, calm and professional. Inside, however, his thoughts kept returning to that small, restless patch of water he had seen near the center of Crystal Lake. By mid-morning, the park had fully awakened. Cars rolled into the main parking lot, children ran ahead of their parents toward the beach area, and the familiar sounds of laughter and conversation drifted through the trees. The pleasant, ordinary life of the park moved forward without any hint that something might be wrong. Marcus took comfort in that normality, but he did not allow it to distract him. Experience had taught him that problems rarely announced themselves with drama. They usually arrived quietly, wrapped in details that most people overlooked. Around 11 o'clock, he found himself with a short gap in his schedule and decided to return to the lake for another look. The sky had cleared completely by then, and the day had grown warmer. A gentle breeze moved through the branches overhead, carrying with it the fresh scent of pine needles and sun-heated earth. From a distance, the lake looked as inviting as ever. Kayakers had already pushed out from the shore, and a few teenagers splashed in the shallow water near the dock. Everything appeared peaceful, almost cheerful. Marcus approached the same viewing platform where he had stood earlier. The wooden boards creaked softly under his weight, a sound he barely noticed anymore. He leaned against the railing and let his eyes search for the spot he had marked in his memory. It did not take long to find it. The disturbance was still there, and now it seemed slightly more obvious than before. The bubbles rose at irregular intervals, breaking the surface with small, soft pops. They were not numerous enough to alarm a casual observer, but Marcus could see that their pattern had changed. Earlier, they had been scattered and slow. Now they appeared in small clusters, as if something beneath the water was growing more active. The texture of the surface around them had also shifted. Instead of the smooth, glass-like calm that usually defined Crystal Lake, that section carried a faint, trembling motion. He inhaled carefully and noticed the smell again, stronger this time. It drifted toward him on the light breeze, sharp and unpleasant. There was a sourness to it, mixed with something heavier that he could not immediately identify. It reminded him of old, stagnant ponds he had encountered in other parks, yet this odor carried an edge that felt out of place in a natural setting. Marcus wrinkled his nose and glanced around to see if anyone else reacted. The nearby visitors seemed unaware, laughing and taking photographs without concern. Marcus stepped down from the platform and walked closer to the shoreline. From this angle, he could see more clearly how the color of the water had changed. Along the edges, it remained its usual clear blue-green, but farther out, especially near the bubbling area, the lake had taken on a faint brownish tint. It was subtle, the kind of difference that might escape notice unless a person knew the water well. Marcus knew it very well. He crouched near the water and studied it more carefully. No oil sheen floated on the surface. No trash or debris had gathered near the bank. The change seemed to come from within the lake itself rather than from anything floating on top of it. He dipped his fingers in and lifted a small sample. The water felt slightly warmer than he expected, though not alarmingly so. He brought his hand close to his face and caught another trace of that unpleasant smell. A group of ducks glided past a few yards away, heading for the reeds on the opposite side. Normally, they would have lingered near people, hoping for crumbs or attention. Today, they kept their distance, paddling quickly away from the shore as if they preferred to be elsewhere. Marcus watched them disappear and felt a small knot of unease tighten in his chest. Animals often sensed trouble long before humans did. He considered possible explanations one by one. Seasonal algae blooms sometimes colored lakes and produced strange odors. Shifts in temperature could release pockets of natural gas from the lake bed. Heavy rain upstream might have washed organic material into the water. All of those possibilities existed, yet none of them fit perfectly with what he was observing. Crystal Lake was usually stable and predictable. Changes here tended to happen slowly, not overnight. Marcus stood and walked along the shore for several minutes, looking for any sign that might explain what was happening. He examined the small creek that fed into the lake from the north. Its water appeared clear and healthy, carrying none of the brown tint he had noticed farther out. He checked the opposite direction where another narrow stream carried water away from the lake toward lower ground. That stream also looked normal. Whatever was affecting the lake seemed to be centered within it rather than coming from outside. A pair of fishermen preparing their gear on the dock caught his attention. Marcus approached them and asked casually whether they had noticed anything unusual that morning. The men shrugged and said the lake seemed fine to them, though one mentioned that the water smelled a little odd near the middle. They laughed it off and suggested it was probably just rotting weeds. Marcus thanked them and moved on, filing away their comment as one more small piece of the puzzle. He returned to the platform and took several photographs with his phone, making sure to capture the bubbling area from different angles. He recorded a short video as well, hoping it might show details that the naked eye missed. Then, he pulled out his notebook and added new observations beneath the notes he had written earlier. The discipline of writing calmed him. It turned vague worry into organized information. As the minutes passed, he noticed another change. The bubbles seemed to be appearing more frequently now, and a faint mist hovered just above the water in that specific zone. It was not the ordinary morning fog that lifted with the sun. This vapor clung stubbornly to the surface, rising in thin wisps that dissolved only slowly. Marcus had seen similar effects above hot springs and chemical ponds. Seeing it here, above a beloved recreational lake, unsettled him deeply. He decided it was time to inform the park office. Taking out his radio, he contacted the duty supervisor and described what he had observed in calm, measured language. He avoided dramatic words and focused on facts. Discoloration near the center of the lake. Unusual odor. Persistent bubbling. possible temperature difference. The supervisor listened, asked a few questions, and agreed that Marcus should continue to monitor the situation throughout the day. For the moment, there was no reason to cause alarm. After ending the call, Marcus felt a mixture of relief and frustration. Part of him hoped the problem would fade away on its own, proving his concerns unnecessary. Another part suspected that the situation was only beginning. He chose a bench near the platform and sat for a while, watching the water and the people who enjoyed it without fear. A family arrived with a small inflatable boat, planning to paddle out toward the deeper section of the lake. Marcus hesitated, then walked over and gently suggested they stay closer to the shore for the time being. He explained that he was keeping an eye on some minor water conditions and preferred to limit activity near the center until he knew more. The parents accepted his advice without argument, though they looked slightly puzzled. Moments like that reminded Marcus how much responsibility rested quietly on his shoulders. The sun climbed higher and the day grew warmer. Instead of improving, the smell drifting from the lake became more noticeable. A few visitors wrinkled their noses and wondered aloud whether something had died nearby. Marcus continued his observations, trying to judge whether the changes were accelerating or simply becoming more obvious in the stronger daylight. He walked once more along the shoreline, this time extending his inspection farther than before. Near a cluster of rocks, he noticed several small fish floating belly up, their silver sides glinting in the sun. A single dead fish could be coincidence. Several of them together were harder to ignore. He photographed the scene and marked the location carefully. That discovery tipped the balance in his mind. Whatever was happening was no longer just an odd curiosity. Something in the lake was beginning to affect living creatures, and that meant potential danger for everything else connected to it. Marcus felt a surge of determination replace his earlier uncertainty. He had seen enough to know that the situation deserved more serious attention. Before leaving the area, he placed a temporary sign near the main access path, advising visitors to avoid swimming in the lake until further notice due to water quality checks. It was a small precaution, but it gave him a sense of control. Most people read the sign, shrugged, and found other ways to enjoy the park. A few asked questions, and Marcus answered them as honestly as he could without causing panic. As afternoon approached, he returned to his vehicle and prepared to continue the rest of his duties. Yet, his thoughts remained anchored to Crystal Lake. The problem he had first noticed as a faint irregularity had grown more complex with each passing hour. The bubbles, the discoloration, the strange odor, and now the dead fish formed a pattern he could not dismiss. Driving away from the shoreline, Marcus glanced back through the trees at the broad, shining surface of the water. From a distance, it still looked beautiful, almost perfect. Only someone who had stood close enough would know that something beneath that calm exterior was quietly changing. He promised himself that he would return again before the end of his shift and keep watching. The park around him continued its cheerful rhythm, unaware of his concerns. Families unpacked lunches, hikers set off along shaded trails, and children chased one another across open fields. Life moved forward as it always did, but Marcus carried with him the growing certainty that the peaceful balance of the park had been disturbed, and that whatever had begun in the depths of Crystal Lake was not finished yet. By the time Marcus returned to the lake later that afternoon, the day had lost much of its earlier brightness. The sun still shone, but the air felt heavier, as if the atmosphere itself had changed its mood. He parked near the same trailhead and walked the familiar path again, moving a little faster this time. The uneasiness that had followed him since morning had grown into something more definite, something that refused to be ignored. Even before the water came into view, he noticed the difference. The unpleasant odor reached him halfway down the trail, carried on the warm breeze and thick, sour waves. It was no longer a faint hint that could be dismissed as natural decay. Now it had strength and persistence, clinging to the air and making him instinctively breathe more shallowly. A few visitors walking in the opposite direction commented loudly about the smell as they passed, holding their noses and laughing nervously. Marcus answered their questions as calmly as he could, assuring them that the situation was being monitored. When he stepped out onto the viewing platform, he stopped in surprise. The lake no longer looked like the same peaceful body of water he had seen only hours earlier. The discoloration had spread far beyond the small central area he had first observed. Large sections of the surface now carried a dull brown tint, as if muddy water had been poured into the lake from below. The once clear reflections of trees and sky appeared blurred and lifeless. The bubbling had intensified as well. Instead of isolated pockets of activity, several zones across the lake now showed constant movement. Clusters of bubbles rose and burst in quick succession, sending small ripples outward. In some places, the surface actually seemed to tremble, as though something beneath the water was struggling to escape. Marcus felt a chill despite the warmth of the day. He took out his binoculars and scanned the shoreline. Near the reeds on the western side, he spotted more dead fish drifting in the shallows. A few birds circled uncertainly overhead, but refused to land on the water. Even the usual chorus of insects that filled the area seemed strangely muted. The entire ecosystem appeared to be reacting to whatever was happening below the surface. Marcus pulled out his radio and contacted the park office again. This time, his tone carried more urgency. He described the rapid changes he was witnessing and requested that additional staff come to the lake to help manage the growing number of concerned visitors. The supervisor agreed immediately and promised to send 2 rangers within the hour. Marcus felt a small measure of relief, knowing he would not be handling the situation alone much longer. He left the platform and walked along the beach where families had been swimming earlier in the day. Most of them had already packed up and moved on, driven away by the smell and the murky appearance of the water. A few stubborn teenagers still lingered near the edge, daring one another to wade in despite the warning sign Marcus had posted. He approached them firmly and explained that swimming was no longer permitted until further notice. This time, there was no argument. The seriousness in his voice convinced them quickly. Near the boat dock, he found one of the kayaks pulled halfway onto the sand. The owner, a middle-aged man with a camera around his neck, told Marcus that he had turned back after only a few minutes on the water because the smell made him feel dizzy. Marcus thanked him for the information and made another note in his notebook. Personal reactions like that were important clues. Whatever was rising from the lake was strong enough to affect people directly. As he continued his inspection, Marcus noticed something new that troubled him even more. Along certain stretches of shoreline, a thin, dark residue had begun to collect on the rocks and vegetation. It looked almost oily, yet it did not shimmer the way real oil would. When he touched it carefully with a gloved finger, it left a sticky stain. This was not a normal byproduct of algae or mud. It suggested that some foreign substance was mixing with the water. He followed the edge of the lake toward the northern inlet where the small creek flowed in. Earlier that day, the water there had looked perfectly clear. Now, even that stream carried a faint brown tint. Marcus knelt and studied it closely, trying to determine whether the discoloration was coming from upstream or being pulled back from the lake itself. After several minutes, he concluded that the change was spreading outward from the lake rather than entering it from elsewhere. The source, whatever it was, lay beneath the deeper water. A low rumbling sound reached his ears, so faint at first that he thought he imagined it. He stood still and listened. The sound came again, a soft, gurgling echo that seemed to rise from the center of the lake along with a fresh surge of bubbles. Marcus felt the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He had never heard anything like that here before. By late afternoon, the situation had grown impossible to ignore. More visitors complained of headaches and nausea after spending time near the water. A dog, brought to the beach by a family, refused to drink and whined nervously until they led it away. Marcus realized that what had begun as a simple environmental irregularity was now turning into a potential public safety issue. The 2 additional rangers arrived as promised and joined him on the platform. Together, they discussed what they were seeing and agreed that stronger measures were necessary. With their help, Marcus closed the main access path to the lake entirely, stretching bright tape across the entrance and placing larger warning signs where everyone could see them. It was an uncomfortable decision, knowing how many people had planned their day around this popular spot, but none of them doubted that it was the right choice. As the area slowly emptied, Marcus finally had a chance to observe the lake without constant interruptions. Standing in the quiet, he felt as though he were watching a living creature fall ill. The bubbling continued to spread. The mist hovering above the water grew thicker, drifting lazily toward the trees like pale smoke. The smell reached a level that made his eyes sting. He took several more samples using a small emergency testing kit kept in the ranger vehicle. The basic readings told him little, only confirming that something abnormal was present. The pH level appeared slightly off, and the water temperature near the bubbling zones registered higher than expected. None of it explained the full picture. Marcus knew they needed professional equipment and trained scientists to understand what was truly happening. Before leaving for the evening briefing, he walked once more along the entire perimeter of the lake, documenting every detail he could find. He photographed the dead fish, the strange residue, the widening patches of discolored water. He marked the locations on a map and recorded the time of each observation. The methodical routine helped him stay focused, but it did nothing to reduce his growing concern. At one point, he noticed a small flock of birds resting in the trees above the water. One of them suddenly dropped to the ground, fluttering weakly before falling still. Marcus hurried over and examined it with a sinking heart. The bird showed no obvious injuries. Its death seemed to be another silent symptom of the invisible threat spreading through the lake. As the sun began to sink towards the horizon, casting long orange reflections across the troubled surface, Marcus contacted the park office again and delivered a full report. This time, the response was immediate and serious. The superintendent decided to notify the state environmental agency and request expert assistance as soon as possible. A formal inspection team would be called in at first light. Hearing that decision, Marcus felt both relief and apprehension. Relief that the problem was finally being treated with the urgency it deserved, and apprehension about what the experts might discover. He had seen enough in a single day to know that the park faced something far beyond routine maintenance or minor pollution. When he finally prepared to leave the area for the night, he stood for a long moment on the empty platform and looked out over Crystal Lake. The water glowed dimly in the fading light, restless and unhealthy. The peaceful image that had greeted him that morning felt like a memory from another time. Less than 12 hours had passed, yet the transformation seemed enormous. Marcus turned away and headed back toward his vehicle, carrying the weight of the day on his shoulders. He understood now that the anomaly he had first noticed as a few harmless bubbles was only the beginning of a much larger crisis. What he did not yet know was how deep that crisis ran, or how dangerous it might become. Behind him, the lake continued to churn quietly in the gathering darkness, releasing its strange vapors into the night. The park grew silent as visitors departed, unaware that the heart of their beloved landscape was slipping further into trouble with every passing hour. Night did little to calm Marcus's thoughts. Even after he left the park and returned to his small apartment on the edge of town, the image of the lake stayed with him, vivid and unsettling. He lay awake for hours, replaying the events of the day in his mind, trying to convince himself that there might still be a simple explanation. But every time he reviewed what he had seen, the same conclusion returned. Something was very wrong beneath the surface of Crystal Lake, and it was getting worse far too quickly. By early morning, he was back in uniform, arriving at the ranger station before most of his colleagues. The air outside felt fresher than it had the day before, but Marcus knew that meant nothing. Problems like the one developing in the park did not disappear overnight simply because a new day had begun. He checked the schedule board and saw that the superintendent had already arranged a meeting with representatives from the State Environmental Agency. The inspection team was expected to arrive within a few hours. The atmosphere at the station carried a new seriousness. Word had spread quickly among the staff, and conversations that morning were quieter, more cautious. Several rangers asked Marcus for details, and he described everything he had observed as clearly as he could. He did not exaggerate, yet he did not hide his concern either. Most of them trusted his judgment. When Marcus Grant said a situation felt dangerous, people listened. Shortly after 9 o'clock, a small convoy of vehicles rolled into the main parking area. From them stepped men and women wearing the insignia of environmental protection agencies, carrying cases of equipment and clipboards thick with forms. Marcus watched them unload and felt a mixture of relief and tension. Their arrival meant that the problem was finally being treated as more than a local inconvenience. It also meant that whatever they discovered might confirm his worst fears. The superintendent introduced Marcus as the ranger who had first noticed the anomaly, and the lead investigator asked him to give a full account of everything from the beginning. Standing in the conference room with maps spread across the table, Marcus carefully retraced the timeline. He explained how the bubbles had appeared, how the odor had grown stronger, how the discoloration and wildlife deaths had followed. The experts listened closely, asking occasional questions, but mostly allowing him to speak without interruption. When he finished, the lead investigator nodded slowly and suggested that they all go to the lake immediately. Marcus guided them along the same trail he had walked so many times before. As they approached the water, several of the specialists exchanged uneasy looks. The smell reached them long before the shoreline came into view. One of them muttered that it was stronger than he had expected. From the platform, the situation looked even more disturbing than it had the previous evening. Overnight, the brown tint had deepened, giving large portions of the lake a dull, unhealthy appearance. The bubbling zones had expanded again, and the mist hanging above the surface seemed thicker and more persistent. The peaceful beauty that had once defined the area was almost completely gone. The experts began their work methodically. They collected water samples from different depths using long metal poles and sealed containers. They measured temperature, oxygen levels, and chemical composition. They set up small devices to monitor the gases rising from the water. Marcus watched them move with practiced efficiency, grateful for their professionalism, but anxious about what their instruments might reveal. As the first preliminary readings came in, the atmosphere among the team grew more serious. Several measurements fell outside normal ranges, though no one was yet willing to state exactly what that meant. The lead investigator explained that the data suggested an unusual process taken place on the lake bed, possibly involving decomposing material or some kind of trapped gas source. He admitted that the pattern did not match any common natural event they normally encountered. While the testing continued, Marcus led a smaller group around the shoreline to show them the dead fish and the sticky residue he had discovered the day before. The specialists examined everything carefully, photographing and collecting additional samples. One of them remarked that the residue felt more like industrial waste than anything produced by nature. Hearing those words, Marcus felt his unease sharpen. After several hours of observation and discussion, the team gathered again on the platform to consider their options. It was clear that simply waiting and monitoring would not be enough. Whatever was happening beneath the water was intensifying, and the potential risk to visitors, wildlife, and the broader environment could not be ignored. The question was how to uncover the source without making the situation worse. The lead investigator proposed a more direct approach. The only way to understand what lay beneath the bubbling zones, he explained, was to lower the water level enough to expose parts of the lake bed. That would allow them to see whether a natural formation, a buildup of organic matter, or perhaps some man-made structure was responsible. The suggestion immediately drew serious expressions from everyone present. Partially draining a major lake inside a national park was not a decision taken lightly. Marcus listened as they debated the practical challenges. Powerful pumps would be required, along with a safe place to divert the removed water so it would not spread contamination downstream. Heavy equipment would have to be brought in, and access to the entire area would need to be tightly controlled. There was also the risk that disturbing the water might release even more of the gases currently trapped below. Despite the complications, the experts agreed that it was the most responsible course of action. The superintendent approved the plan on the spot. Arrangements were made to bring in industrial pumps from a nearby city and to establish temporary containment basins where the drained water could be held and treated if necessary. Marcus felt a strange mixture of apprehension and determination. The situation had moved beyond observation. Now it would become an active operation. By early afternoon, the first trucks began to arrive, their engines rumbling as they backed into position near the shoreline. Long hoses were unrolled and connected to massive portable pumps. Technicians in protective gear prepared generators and monitoring equipment. The sudden appearance of so much machinery transformed the quiet lakeside into something resembling a construction site. News of the operation spread quickly, and despite efforts to keep the area closed, a small crowd of curious locals gathered near the outer barriers. Some took photographs, others asked anxious questions. Marcus and the other rangers worked to maintain order, explaining that the measures were precautionary and that no immediate danger existed outside the restricted zone. Inside, however, everyone involved understood that the margin for error was thin. When the pumps were finally activated, a deep mechanical hum filled the air. Water began to flow steadily through the thick hoses into the temporary basins. At first, the effect on the lake was barely noticeable, but as the hours passed, the level slowly began to drop. Marcus stood with the investigators watching the process, aware that they were now committed to uncovering whatever secret the water had been hiding. Almost immediately, the reaction from the lake grew stronger. As the pressure on the bottom changed, the bubbling intensified, sending larger bursts of gas to the surface. In some places, the water seemed to boil, releasing foul-smelling clouds that drifted across the platform. Sensors placed around the area detected increasing concentrations of methane and other gases. Safety officers ordered everyone to wear protective masks. The sight was both fascinating and frightening. What had begun as a few gentle disturbances had turned into a restless, churning expanse of water. Marcus could see worry on the faces of even the most experienced specialists. One of them remarked quietly that he had never seen a reaction quite like this in any previous investigation. As the level continued to fall, patches of muddy shoreline that had been underwater for years began to appear. Dark streaks marked the slopes leading down toward the center. In the newly exposed areas, small streams of bubbles emerged directly from the wet soil, confirming that the source lay somewhere deeper still. Late in the afternoon, as the sun began to sink, Marcus noticed something that made him catch his breath. Near the central part of the lake, where the bubbling was most violent, a shape was slowly becoming visible beneath the thinning water. At first, it looked like nothing more than an oddly straight line in the mud, but as the pumps continued their work, more lines appeared, forming angles that nature rarely created on its own. He pointed it out to the lead investigator, who studied the area through binoculars for a long moment. The man lowered them slowly, his expression hard to read. Whatever was down there, he said, it did not look natural. Hearing those words, Marcus felt a cold certainty settle over him. The problem was no longer simply environmental. There was something hidden at the bottom of Crystal Lake, something that had never been meant to be found. And as the water receded further, it was beginning to reveal itself at last. Night fell with the pumps still running, their steady rhythm echoing across the darkened park. Powerful lights were set up around the work zone, casting harsh white beams over the restless surface. Marcus remained on duty long after his normal shift would have ended, unable to leave while the operation continued. Standing beside the platform, watching the troubled lake slowly surrender its secrets, he understood that the real discovery was only beginning. The next day, when more of the lake bed lay exposed, they would finally see what had caused the chaos, and Marcus had a feeling that whatever they found would change the park forever. The pumps worked through the night, their mechanical heartbeat echoing across the dark surface of Crystal Lake. Even after most of the specialists left to rest in temporary trailers, the machines never stopped. Long hoses snaked from the shoreline like heavy black veins, carrying the lake's troubled water into lined containment basins that glowed under floodlights. Marcus remained on site far later than his schedule required, unwilling to abandon the scene while so much remained uncertain. By morning, the lake looked dramatically different. Where there had once been a broad, smooth sheet of water, there was now a gradually shrinking pool surrounded by wide rings of exposed mud and wet stone. The shoreline had retreated several yards, revealing plants and rocks that had been hidden for years. It was as if the lake were slowly surrendering territory to the land, pulled back by the relentless pull of the pumps. Marcus arrived before sunrise to relieve the night crew. The air was cool and damp, but the odor that drifted from the water had not faded. If anything, it seemed sharper than before. As soon as he stepped out of his vehicle, he noticed technicians already moving about in protective masks, checking gauges and adjusting equipment. The sense of urgency that had filled the previous day had not diminished. It had grown stronger. Standing on the platform, Marcus surveyed the scene with a mixture of fascination and dread. The exposed lake bed near the edges looked ordinary enough, covered in layers of dark silt and scattered with smooth stones. But farther out, where the water still remained deeper, the bubbling activity had increased to a disturbing degree. Large pockets of gas broke the surface with heavy gurgling sounds, sending thick rings of ripples across the remaining water. Several specialists gathered near Marcus, studying the behavior of the lake with serious expressions. One of them explained that as the water level dropped, pressure on the trapped gases below decreased, allowing them to escape more violently. What had been gentle bubbling before had turned into something far more aggressive. Sensors placed around the site recorded spikes in methane and traces of other volatile compounds. Safety officers moved through the area, reminding everyone to keep their masks secured and to avoid lingering too close to the most active zones. The situation was becoming not only an environmental concern, but a direct physical hazard. Marcus felt a new level of tension settle over the operation. What they were doing was necessary, yet it also seemed to be provoking the lake in unpredictable ways. As the morning progressed, the pumps continued their steady labor. The water receded inch by inch, revealing more of the hidden bottom. Marcus walked along the newly formed shoreline with one of the investigators, examining the strange patterns left in the mud. In some places, the silt appeared churned and uneven, as if something beneath it had been pushing upward for a long time. Thin streams of bubbles rose directly from cracks in the soil, creating tiny fountains that hissed softly in the cool air. Near the northern side of the lake, a group of workers discovered a cluster of dead fish half buried in the drying mud. Their bodies were coated with the same dark residue Marcus had noticed earlier. The sight was grim but no longer surprising. The ecosystem was clearly suffering from whatever toxic process had taken hold. Each new discovery added weight to the urgency of the investigation. Around mid-morning, a sudden surge of activity erupted near the central zone. A particularly large pocket of gas burst through the surface with a loud, wet roar, sending a plume of mist several feet into the air. The workers nearby jumped back instinctively, and the safety alarms on their detectors began to chirp. Marcus hurried toward them, heart pounding, but the moment passed as quickly as it had begun. The lake settled again into its restless churning. Incidents like that became more frequent as the day wore on. The deeper water seemed almost alive with movement now, as if something enormous were struggling beneath it. The specialists spoke in low voices about the risk of explosive concentrations building up if the gases were not vented carefully. Additional ventilation equipment was brought in, and the perimeter around the most active area was widened. Despite the danger, curiosity among the local population grew. By late morning, a crowd had gathered beyond the outer barriers, watching the operation from a distance. News crews arrived with cameras and bright vans, eager to capture images of the mysterious draining lake. Marcus and the other rangers found themselves juggling two responsibilities at once, assisting the investigators and keeping the public safely away. Questions came from every direction. People wanted to know whether the water was poisoned, whether their drinking supply was at risk, whether the park would be closed for weeks or months. Marcus answered as honestly as he could, explaining that the situation was still under evaluation. Inside, he shared many of the same concerns. Each hour brought new evidence that the problem might be far more serious than anyone had first imagined. Shortly after noon, the water level dropped enough to expose the uppermost portions of the strange shape Marcus had noticed the previous evening. What had looked like faint lines beneath the surface now appeared more clearly as solid edges. From the platform, he could see sections of dark metal protruding from the mud, forming angles that were unmistakably man-made. The sight sent a ripple of unease through everyone present. The lead investigator called for binoculars and studied the area intently. After a long silence, he confirmed what Marcus had already suspected. They were not dealing with a natural formation. Something artificial lay buried at the bottom of the lake. No one yet knew what it was, but its presence changed the entire nature of the crisis. Work intensified immediately. Engineers adjusted the position of the pumps to lower the water around the object more quickly. Drones were launched to capture aerial images from above, providing a clearer view of the emerging structure. Each new photograph revealed additional straight lines and hard surfaces. Whatever had been hidden down there was larger than anyone had expected. The reaction from the gases grew even more dramatic as the surrounding water thinned. Streams of bubbles erupted along the edges of the metal form, as if the object itself were releasing pressure built up over decades. Thick vapors drifted upward in wavering clouds, forcing the workers to retreat periodically until the air cleared. Marcus watched it all with a sense of awe tinged with fear. They were peeling back layers of history that perhaps had never been meant to be uncovered. Throughout the afternoon, the operation became a careful dance between progress and safety. Whenever the pumps lowered the level too quickly, the bubbling would surge violently, threatening to overwhelm the monitoring equipment. The technicians learned to adjust their pace, giving the lake time to release its trapped gases more gradually. It was slow, exhausting work, but no one dared rush it. At one point, a safety officer ordered a temporary halt after sensors detected an unusually high concentration of methane near the shoreline. For nearly an hour, the site fell quiet except for the faint hiss of escaping gas. Marcus stood beside the investigators during the pause, staring at the dark outline growing clearer in the mud. He could not shake the feeling that they were standing on the edge of a discovery that would reshape everything they thought they knew about the park. As evening approached, more of the object became visible. Its surface was badly corroded and coated with thick layers of slime, yet its industrial character was undeniable. Sections resembled panels or plates, connected by bolts long eaten away by time. In one area, a round shape suggested the remains of a hatch or access point. The specialists spoke in hushed tones about old storage tanks, abandoned pipelines, and forgotten construction projects. Marcus felt the weight of the day settling into his bones. The operation had transformed from a simple environmental check into something far larger and more complicated. The park he had known for years, the place he believed to be pure and protected, now held a secret buried beneath its most cherished landmark. As darkness returned and the floodlights flickered on once more, the pumps resumed their steady rhythm. The remaining pool of water at the center of the lake had grown much smaller, but the activity within it showed no sign of calming. If anything, the bubbling seemed more frantic, as though the lake were resisting the intrusion. Standing near the edge of the platform, Marcus looked out over the altered landscape and wondered what the next day would bring. The panic that had hovered on the fringes all afternoon felt closer now, more real. People whispered about contamination, explosions, and long-term damage. The once peaceful park had become the focus of fear and speculation. Yet, amid the uncertainty, Marcus also felt a grim determination. Whatever lay beneath Crystal Lake needed to be uncovered and dealt with, no matter how dangerous or complicated the process might be. The safety of the park, and everyone who depended on it, demanded nothing less. Late that night, as the final shift prepared to continue the work under artificial light, Marcus took one last walk along the muddy shoreline. The exposed bottom stretched before him like unfamiliar territory, scarred and steaming. In the center, the dark metallic shape waited silently, half revealed and still mysterious. He knew that when morning came, they would finally see it in full. And with that knowledge would come answers, perhaps frightening ones. The calm routine of his life as a ranger had already been shattered. Now he could only move forward, step by careful step, into whatever truth the draining lake was preparing to reveal. Morning returned to the park with a pale gray sky and a damp chill that clung to the ground like a thin blanket. The air smelled of wet earth and machinery, mixed with the persistent chemical odor that had become an unwelcome companion to everyone working near the lake. Marcus arrived early once again, long before the first curious onlookers would gather beyond the barriers. He felt as though he had not truly slept at all, only closed his eyes for a few hours while his mind continued to circle around the same troubling images. From a distance, the lake no longer resembled the familiar landscape he had known for years. What remained of the water now formed a shallow, irregular pool surrounded by wide rings of dark, exposed mud. The once graceful shoreline had turned into a raw scar across the heart of the park. And at the very center of that scar lay the object they had been slowly uncovering, more visible now than ever before. Marcus walked toward the platform where the lead investigators were already gathered. Overnight, the pumps had continued their relentless work, and the water level had dropped enough to reveal nearly the entire outline of the mysterious structure. In the cold morning light, its shape looked even more unnatural, a foreign presence intruding on a place that had always belonged to nature. Up close, the object appeared larger than anyone had initially guessed. It stretched across a wide section of the lake bed, partially embedded in layers of thick silt. The visible portions suggested heavy industrial construction, thick metal plates, corroded seams, and long straight edges that could never have formed by chance. In several places, the surface bulged outward as if pressure from within had been pushing against it for decades. The specialists moved around it carefully, maintaining a safe distance while examining every detail through cameras and measuring equipment. Marcus joined them, listening as they exchanged cautious theories. Some believed it might be an old underground storage tank. Others suggested a forgotten section of pipeline infrastructure, or even the remnants of an abandoned treatment facility. None of the possibilities fit comfortably with the location. This was protected federal land, not an industrial zone. As more daylight filled the clearing, additional teams arrived to expand the investigation. Historical researchers were brought in to search archives and maps for any record that might explain the presence of such a structure. Environmental chemists prepared to take direct samples from the material coating its surface. Engineers discussed how to stabilize the surrounding mud so that closer inspection could be carried out safely. Marcus watched it all with a growing sense of disbelief. Only a few days earlier, his biggest concerns had been lost hikers and minor rule violations. Now, he stood beside a massive unknown object buried at the bottom of the park's most treasured lake, surrounded by experts who treated it with the caution usually reserved for unexploded ordnance. One of the engineers approached him and asked for a detailed description of how the lake had looked before the crisis began. Marcus explained patiently, pointing out where the beach had been, where families had once gathered, and how clear the water used to appear. The engineer shook his head slowly and remarked that it was hard to imagine such a peaceful place hiding something like this. Late in the morning, a small drone was launched to fly directly over the structure and capture high-resolution images. The footage appeared on a portable screen, revealing details that could not be seen from the ground. The object was roughly rectangular, with reinforced ridges running along its length. In one corner, a circular hatch-like feature could be seen, its edges eaten away by rust. Pipes or conduits emerged from another section, disappearing back into the mud like buried veins. The more they studied it, the clearer it became that this was not a random piece of discarded equipment. It had been placed here deliberately and constructed to remain hidden. That realization sent a ripple of unease through the entire team. By midday, the historians returned with their first findings, and the atmosphere grew even more tense. Old documents revealed that decades earlier, long before the park had expanded to its current size, portions of the surrounding land had been used for various short-term industrial projects. Records from the 1970s mentioned temporary waste storage areas and construction staging sites that were supposedly dismantled when the park boundaries were redefined. None of the papers, however, listed any permanent installations within what later became Crystal Lake. The implication was troubling. If the structure had not been officially recorded, then it had either been forgotten or intentionally concealed. Marcus felt a cold knot form in his stomach as he listened to the discussion. The idea that someone might have hidden something dangerous here, beneath one of the most beautiful places in the region, filled him with quiet anger. The environmental chemists prepared to take the first direct samples from the surface of the object. Wearing thick protective suits and respirators, two technicians carefully approached the exposed edge and scraped small amounts of the dark residue into sealed containers. Everyone else stepped back, watching in tense silence. The material looked thick and tar-like, clinging stubbornly to the corroded metal. Within minutes, portable analyzers began to display preliminary results. The data suggested the presence of industrial solvents and other toxic compounds that should never have been anywhere near a natural lake. The gases escaping from the mud were almost certainly byproducts of those chemicals breaking down over time. Hearing that confirmation, Marcus understood at last why the water had turned deadly so quickly. The superintendent ordered an immediate expansion of the safety perimeter. Access roads were closed, and additional warnings were issued to nearby communities. What had begun as a local environmental concern was rapidly escalating into a potential public health emergency. News reporters gathered at the gates, broadcasting images of the strange structure to viewers across the state. Throughout the afternoon, the investigation continued with methodical care. Engineers discussed how to reach the hatch without triggering a dangerous release of trapped material. Geologists studied the surrounding soil to determine how far any contamination might have spread. The more they learned, the more complicated the situation appeared. Marcus spent much of the day assisting wherever he could, guiding teams around the park and explaining the layout of trails and waterways. Though he was not a scientist, his knowledge of the terrain proved invaluable. Several experts thanked him personally for noticing the early signs and pushing for action before the damage had grown even worse. Their gratitude brought him little comfort. He kept thinking about how close visitors had come to swimming in poisoned water only days earlier. As evening approached, the investigators gathered to review everything they had discovered. The consensus was grim. The structure was almost certainly an old industrial reservoir used to store hazardous waste many years ago. Over time, its metal walls had corroded, allowing chemicals to leak slowly into the lake bed. Recent environmental changes or structural collapse had finally accelerated the process, triggering the sudden crisis Marcus had observed. No one could yet say who had built it or why it had been left behind. The possibility of criminal negligence or even deliberate illegal dumping hung heavily in the air. Federal authorities were notified, and a formal inquiry was launched to trace responsibility. Standing at the edge of the drained lake, Marcus listened to the conclusions with a mixture of relief and sorrow. Relief that they finally understood the cause. Sorrow that such a beautiful place had been silently poisoned by decisions made long before he ever arrived here. The sun dipped low behind the trees, casting long shadows across the exposed mud. The once lively shoreline lay silent except for the steady hum of equipment. Marcus looked out at the corroded structure and imagined all the summers it had spent hidden beneath clear water while families laughed and children played above it, unaware of the danger sleeping just below. In that moment, he realized that the park he loved would never feel quite the same again. Its surface beauty now carried the weight of an unseen history, a reminder that even protected places could bear scars from the past. As darkness settled over the site, the investigators prepared for the next phase of the operation. The difficult task of neutralizing and removing whatever remained inside the buried reservoir. Marcus remained on duty until the last trucks rolled out and the work lights flickered on for the night shift. Walking slowly back toward his vehicle, he paused to look once more at the hollowed lake. The secret it had kept for so long was finally exposed, but the danger was far from over. The real challenge was only beginning, and the responsibility for guiding the park through it would fall on many shoulders, including his own. He climbed into the driver's seat and sat quietly for a moment, listening to the distant sounds of machinery echoing across the darkened landscape. The peaceful world he had known had been permanently altered. Yet, despite everything, Marcus felt a stubborn determination growing inside him. The truth had come to light because he had paid attention when something seemed wrong. Now, he would see the process through to the end, whatever it required. Behind him, under the glow of artificial lights, the forbidden structure waited like a relic from another era, holding the final pieces of a mystery that was only now beginning to be understood. The revelation of the buried structure changed everything, and it changed it quickly. What had begun as a quiet environmental concern inside the boundaries of a national park was now something much larger, something that reached beyond the authority of local rangers and even beyond the state agencies that had first arrived to help. By the following morning, the site no longer belonged only to the park. It had become the focus of a federal investigation, a potential crime scene, and a public health emergency all at once. Marcus sensed the shift as soon as he arrived at dawn. New vehicles filled the access road, marked with insignias he rarely saw in his daily work. Representatives from federal environmental protection departments, hazardous materials units, and investigative branches moved through the area with serious, deliberate efficiency. The temporary command center that had been set up near the shoreline had grown overnight into a small operational hub filled with maps, computers, and radio equipment. The calm professionalism of the previous days had been replaced by a sharper, more urgent atmosphere. One of the first decisions made that morning was the complete closure of the entire section of the park surrounding Crystal Lake. The partial restrictions that Marcus and the other rangers had managed earlier were no longer sufficient. The specialists now understood that the danger was not limited to the immediate shoreline. Toxic vapors, contaminated soil, and the possibility of further leaks from the hidden reservoir created risks that extended far beyond the water itself. The superintendent gathered the rangers and explained the new orders. All campgrounds within several miles were to be evacuated immediately. Hiking trails would be blocked, parking areas sealed off, and public access suspended until further notice. It was an extreme measure, one rarely taken in a place that depended on visitors for its identity and support. Yet no one argued. The evidence was too clear and the stakes too high. Marcus spent the first hours of the day helping to carry out those orders. Together with other rangers, he moved from campsite to campsite, informing families and travelers that they would need to leave for their own safety. Most people accepted the news with worried understanding. A few reacted with frustration, complaining about ruined vacations and wasted plans. Marcus listened patiently, knowing that their disappointment was nothing compared to what could happen if the area remained open. In one campground, he found an elderly couple who had been visiting the park every summer for decades. They packed their belongings in silence while Marcus explained the situation as gently as he could. The woman looked toward the direction of the lake and said quietly that she never imagined anything dangerous could exist in such a beautiful place. Her words stayed with Marcus long after he left them behind. By midday, the evacuation was nearly complete. The roads that had been busy with cars and bicycles only days earlier now lay empty except for emergency vehicles. The laughter of children and the hum of tourists had vanished, replaced by the distant sounds of generators and heavy equipment. The park felt strangely hollow, as if an invisible storm had swept through and carried away its life. Inside the restricted zone, the investigation continued at a relentless pace. The federal teams took command of the operation, establishing strict protocols for every action taken near the exposed structure. Additional barriers were erected, and access was limited to personnel with specialized training. Marcus, because of his knowledge of the terrain and his role in discovering the problem, was allowed to remain as a liaison, but even he now needed clearance to approach certain areas. The next critical step was to determine exactly what remained inside the corroded reservoir. Using remote cameras and robotic tools, engineers carefully examined the hatch-like opening that had become visible as the water receded. They suspected that the interior still contained large amounts of hazardous material, sealed away for decades and now slowly escaping through weakened walls. Opening it without preparation could release a surge of toxic gas or contaminated liquid. While those preparations were underway, chemists continued to analyze samples taken from the lake bed and surrounding soil. Their findings painted a grim picture. The substances identified included industrial solvents, heavy metals, and compounds known to cause severe environmental damage. The bubbling that Marcus had first noticed was now understood to be the result of chemical reactions occurring deep in the mud, producing methane and other dangerous gases as byproducts. The realization spread quickly among the team that if the leak had gone unnoticed for even a short time longer, the contamination might have reached the network of streams and groundwater systems connected to the lake. From there, it could have traveled far beyond the park boundaries, threatening farms, towns, and drinking water supplies. The crisis they were facing was serious enough. The crisis they had narrowly avoided would have been far worse. As the day progressed, investigators began to dig into the history of the land more aggressively. Old construction permits, faded maps, and long-forgotten contracts were pulled from archives. Interviews were conducted with retired workers and former officials who remembered the early years of the park. Piece by piece, a disturbing story began to emerge. Decades earlier, before environmental regulations had grown strict, a private company had been contracted to carry out a short-term industrial project on what was then unprotected land. Temporary waste storage facilities had been built, and hazardous materials had been kept on site with the intention of removing them later. When the project ended and the land was incorporated into the expanding national park, records suggested that the company had quietly abandoned part of its infrastructure rather than paying for proper cleanup. Over time, the area had been flooded and transformed into the lake that visitors came to love. Whether the abandonment had been deliberate or simply the result of negligence was still unclear. What mattered now was that the forgotten reservoir had remained hidden for generations, slowly corroding and poisoning its surroundings. Marcus listened to the explanations with a growing sense of disbelief. The disaster unfolding before him was not the result of a natural accident at all, but of human decisions made long before he had ever set foot in the park. Outside the barriers, the story captured public attention with alarming speed. News helicopters hovered above the forest, capturing images of the drained lake and the mysterious structure at its center. Reporters speculated about secret dumping operations and corporate cover-ups. Rumors spread through nearby communities that the air itself might be dangerous to breathe. Local authorities held press conferences trying to balance honesty with reassurance, but fear had already taken hold. Marcus found himself pulled into that public dimension as well. As one of the first people to recognize the problem, he was asked to give statements and answer questions. He spoke carefully, emphasizing that the situation was under control and that experts were working around the clock to make the area safe. Privately, he knew how fragile that control truly was. Late in the afternoon, the most delicate phase of the operation began. Using remotely operated equipment, technicians slowly pried open the corroded hatch on the top of the reservoir. Everyone watched from a safe distance as the metal lid lifted with agonizing slowness. Sensors stood ready to detect any sudden release of gas. For several tense minutes, nothing happened. Then, a thin column of foul-smelling vapor rose from the opening, twisting into the air like a ghost escaping its prison. The instruments confirmed what they feared. The interior still contained significant quantities of toxic material, trapped and concentrated over many years. Emergency procedures were activated at once. Specialized teams moved in to begin neutralizing the contents using chemical agents designed to reduce volatility and prevent further leakage. It was painstaking, dangerous work that would take days, perhaps weeks, to complete. Watching the process, Marcus felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. Dread at the magnitude of what had been hidden beneath the lake he loved. Relief that it had been found before irreversible damage occurred. The thin line between disaster and recovery seemed clearer to him than ever before. As evening approached, another evacuation order was issued, this time for a small residential area on the edge of the park. Although the risk there was considered low, authorities preferred caution to chance. Buses were arranged to transport families to temporary accommodations. Marcus helped coordinate the effort, knocking on doors and explaining the need for cooperation. Most residents responded with anxious gratitude, aware that the situation had grown far beyond anyone's control. By nightfall, the restricted zone around Crystal Lake had become almost completely silent. Only the glow of work lights and the distant hum of equipment remained. The once lively heart of the park now felt like an isolated island cut off from the rest of the world. Marcus stood near the outer fence as the final vehicles rolled away and wondered how many years would pass before the area could be opened again. He thought about the countless visitors who had walked those trails, the children who had swum in those waters, never knowing what lay beneath their feet. The thought made him shiver despite the warm evening air. Before leaving for the night, he returned once more to the overlook from which he had first noticed the strange bubbles. From there, he could see the drained basin illuminated by harsh white light, the dark shape of the reservoir exposed like a wound in the earth. Teams in protective suits moved slowly around it, fighting a battle that few people would ever fully understand. The truth of the situation was finally clear. The bubbling water, the foul odor, the dying wildlife, all of it had been symptoms of a long, hidden poison finally breaking free. And if Marcus had not paid attention on that ordinary morning, if he had dismissed the first small signs as nothing important, the story might have ended very differently. As he turned to leave, he felt the weight of responsibility settle over him more heavily than before. The discovery had been only the beginning. Now came the harder task of repair, accountability, and recovery. The park, the community, and perhaps even the environment far beyond would depend on the success of what happened next. In the darkness behind him, Crystal Lake lay emptied and wounded, no longer the symbol of untouched beauty it had once been. Yet, within that devastation there was also a fragile hope. The secret had been exposed. The danger had been recognized. And because of that, there was finally a chance to make things right. The days that followed the opening of the hidden reservoir blurred together into a long sequence of cautious progress and controlled tension. What had once been a quiet national park had transformed into a carefully managed recovery zone, filled with specialists, equipment, and procedures that most visitors would never imagine existing in such a place. For Marcus, the work became a new kind of routine, one far different from the peaceful patrols he had known before, yet driven by the same sense of duty that had guided him from the beginning. The first priority was containment. Teams of hazardous materials experts worked around the clock to stabilize the toxic contents of the buried structure. Using remote-controlled pumps and chemical neutralizers, they slowly reduced the volatility of the substances trapped inside. Every step was measured, tested, and repeated with extreme care. There could be no shortcuts. One mistake might undo everything they had accomplished so far. Marcus spent most of his time coordinating between the federal teams and the remaining park staff. Though he was not directly involved in the technical procedures, his knowledge of the land remained invaluable. He guided vehicles along service roads, pointed out sensitive areas that needed protection, and helped design temporary routes that allowed heavy machinery to reach the site without causing unnecessary damage to the surrounding forest. Watching the cleanup unfold, he was struck by how different this phase felt compared to the frantic days of discovery. There was still urgency, but it was now tempered by planning and precision. The panic that had once hovered over the operation gradually gave way to determined focus. The crisis was no longer an unknown monster. It had a name, a shape, and a strategy for defeat. Over the next several weeks, the contaminated water that had been pumped from the lake was carefully treated and filtered. Massive tanks were brought in to process it, removing dangerous chemicals before it could be safely returned to the environment. Sections of polluted soil around the reservoir were excavated and transported away in sealed containers. The exposed metal structure itself was slowly dismantled, cut apart piece by piece, and taken to specialized facilities for disposal. Each stage of the process revealed more about the scale of what had been hidden. The reservoir was far larger than initial estimates suggested, and the amount of hazardous material it had contained was staggering. Investigators concluded that if the leak had continued unchecked, the entire regional watershed might eventually have been affected. The thought of that narrow escape never left Marcus's mind. As the physical cleanup progressed, another kind of work unfolded in parallel, the effort to understand how such a thing had been allowed to happen at all. Federal investigators traced the history of the site back through decades of paperwork and faded memories. They identified the company responsible and uncovered evidence of deliberate negligence. Legal proceedings were initiated, promising accountability for actions that had nearly destroyed a treasured landscape. News of those developments brought mixed reactions from the public. Some expressed anger that corporate shortcuts from the past had endangered so many lives. Others focused on the extraordinary effort being made to repair the damage. Through it all, Marcus became something of an unwilling symbol of vigilance. Reporters frequently asked him how he had known to take the first small signs seriously. He always answered the same way. It was simply his job to notice when something was not right. Gradually, the park itself began to heal. With the toxic source removed and the contaminated areas treated, wildlife slowly returned to the outer edges of the lake. Birds once again nested in the trees. Insects buzzed above the recovering shoreline. The water, after extensive filtration and natural flushing, began to regain hints of its former clarity. Experts warned that full ecological recovery would take years, but the direction was finally positive. Marcus watched those changes with quiet satisfaction. He knew better than anyone how close the ecosystem had come to permanent destruction. Seeing life return, even in small ways, felt like a personal victory. Yet he also understood that the park he loved would never be exactly the same. The memory of what had been discovered beneath Crystal Lake would remain part of its story forever. The reopening of the area happened slowly and carefully. At first, only a few trails were made accessible again, with strict guidelines for visitors. Informational displays were installed explaining what had occurred and how the cleanup had been carried out. Rather than hiding the past, the park chose to acknowledge it openly, turning the crisis into a lesson about environmental responsibility. On the day the lake itself was finally declared safe for public access, Marcus stood on the rebuilt platform and looked out over the water. The surface was calm and clear, reflecting the sky much as it once had. Families gathered along the beach, cautious at first, then gradually more relaxed. Children dipped their hands into the shallows and laughed when the cool water touched their skin. For a moment, Marcus allowed himself to imagine that nothing bad had ever happened here. But he knew the truth. Beneath the restored beauty lay layers of history and hard-earned knowledge. The lake was safe again because people had paid attention, acted responsibly, and refused to look away from an uncomfortable reality. In the months that followed, new policies were introduced throughout the park system. Regular environmental monitoring became more rigorous. Old maps were re-examined for forgotten infrastructure. Training programs emphasized the importance of small observations, encouraging rangers to trust their instincts the way Marcus had trusted his. The crisis at Crystal Lake had changed not only one park, but the way many parks would be cared for in the future. Marcus himself found that the experience had altered his perspective as well. He still loved the quiet mornings and familiar routines, but he no longer took them for granted. Every patrol now carried an added layer of awareness. Beauty, he had learned, did not always guarantee safety. Even the most protected places could hide dangers left behind by human hands. One afternoon, nearly a year after the discovery, He walked alone along the restored shoreline. The scars of the excavation had faded, replaced by new grass and young plants. A pair of ducks glided across the water, leaving gentle ripples behind them. The air smelled clean again, free of the harsh chemical tang that had once filled it. Marcus paused at the spot where the warning signs had first been placed and thought back to that ordinary morning when everything had begun. If he had ignored the bubbles, if he had dismissed the odor as nothing important, the outcome might have been very different. The realization filled him with a quiet sense of responsibility, but also with pride. Doing his job carefully had mattered more than he could ever have imagined. The park gradually returned to its familiar rhythms. Tourists once again filled the campgrounds. Hikers followed the winding trails through sunlit forests. Crystal Lake regained its reputation as one of the most beautiful places in the region. To most visitors, it was simply a lovely destination. Only a few knew the full story of what had happened there. Sometimes, while giving directions or answering questions, Marcus noticed small traces of that history in himself. He listened more closely now to unusual sounds, paid greater attention to subtle changes in the environment. The events at the lake had reminded him that vigilance was not a burden, but a form of care. On the anniversary of the crisis, the park held a small ceremony to acknowledge everyone who had contributed to the recovery. The superintendent spoke about teamwork and dedication, about science and responsibility. When Marcus was invited to say a few words, he kept them simple. He thanked the specialists who had worked tirelessly, the community that had shown patience, and the rangers who had supported one another through uncertain days. He said that protecting nature was not only about preserving beauty, but about confronting problems honestly when they appeared. As the crowd dispersed and the sun set over the trees, Marcus lingered by the water once more. The surface glowed softly in the evening light, peaceful and inviting. It was easy now to believe that the danger had never existed. Yet he knew better. The lake had been saved because people had refused to ignore a warning. Driving home that night, Marcus felt a calm satisfaction settle over him. The crisis was behind them. The park had endured and recovered, and he, in his own quiet way, had played a part in protecting a place that meant so much to so many. Life returned to normal, but it was a wiser, more careful version of normal. Crystal Lake remained at the heart of the park, no longer only a symbol of natural beauty, but also a reminder of resilience and responsibility. And each time Marcus began his morning rounds, breathing the fresh air and listening to the familiar sounds of the forest, he carried with him the knowledge that even in the most perfect places, watchful eyes could make all the difference. If this story surprised you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next one. Watch more videos on the channel right now and share this video with someone who needs to see it.